Nuclear War Survival Skills. Chapter 6 continued. Shelters and ventilating your bunker. Page 60. Shelter ventilation without filters. Numerous tests have shown that the hazards from fallout particles carried into shelters by unfiltered ventilating air are minor compared to the dangers from inadequate ventilation. In 1962, summary of the official standards for ventilating systems of fallout shelters stated, air filters are not essential for small, family-size shelters. More recent findings have led to the same conclusion for large fallout shelters. A 1973 report by the Subcommittee on Fallout of the National Academy of Sciences on the radioiodine inhalation problem stated this conclusion. The opinion of the subcommittee is that inhalation is far less of a threat than ingestion, which means eating or drinking, and does not justify countermeasures such as filters in the ventilating systems of shelters. Recommendations such as those above realistically face the fact that if we suffer a nuclear attack, the vast majority of Americans will have only the fallout protection given by buildings and some expedient shelters. Consequently, how best to use available resources must be the primary consideration when planning for protection against the worst dangers of a nuclear attack. Relatively minor hazards may have to be accepted. For unprepared people, inhalation of fallout particles would be a minor danger compared to being forced out of a shelter because of dangerously inadequate ventilation. The most dangerous fallout particles are those deposited on the ground within the first few hours after the explosion that produces them. Typically, these hot particles would be so large and fast falling that they would not be carried into expedient shelters equipped with low-velocity air intake openings, such as those described in this book. Nor would these most dangerous hot fallout particles be sucked into gooseneck air intake pipes or other properly designed air intake openings of a permanent shelter. For most shelters built or improved hurriedly during a crisis, it will be impractical to provide filtered air. The car over trench shelter pictured in figure 6.3 points up the overriding need for pumped air for occupants of crowded shelters during warm or hot weather. This simple shelter provides fallout protection about 4 times as effective as that given by a typical home basement. After the car was driven over the trench, earth was shoveled into the car and its trunk and on top of its hood. At one end was a combined crawlway entrance / air intake opening at the other end, a 1 foot square air exhaust opening. Each opening was covered by a small awning. To keep loose shielding earth from running under the car and into the trench, the upper edges of 5 foot wide strips of polyethylene film first were attached with duct tape to the sides and ends of the car, about 2 feet above the ground. Then earth was piled onto the parts of the film strips that were lying on the ground to secure them. Finally, earth was piled against the vertical parts of the attached film strips. It's kind of hard to tell from this picture because it's in black and white. It's an older book. But that's the picture right there. You can see a guy's boot. That's about it. Figure 6.3. Pulling a small stick frame cap to keep temperatures endurable for occupants of a car over trench shelter in warm weather. Enough air also can be supplied with a small directional fan, although more laboriously. Placing earth rolls, see page 150, around the sides of an earth-loaded car provides better, more secure side shielding, but requires more materials and work. Inhalation dangers. Only extremely small fallout particles can reach the lungs. The human nose and other air passages can filter out almost all particles 10 micrometers, which means 10 microns or larger, in diameter, and about 95% of those exceeding 5 micrometers. See reference 6, page 599. 5 micrometers equals 5 millionths of a meter, or 5 thousandths of a millimeter. Using a dust mask or breathing through cloth would be helpful to keep from inhaling larger, hot fallout particles, which may cause beta burns in noses, sinuses, and bronchial tubes. Many such retained particles may be swallowed when cleared from one's air passageways by the body's natural protective processes. As shown below in figure 6.4, a relatively large particle, 40 microns, in diameter, spherical, and with the sand-like density of most fallout particles, falls about 1,300 feet in 8 hours. A dark-colored particle, 40 microns in diameter, is about as small a speck as most people can see with the naked eye. Most 40 micron diameter fallout particles would take page 61. Few days to fall from the cloud of a 1 megaton explosion down far enough into the troposphere to be occasionally scavenged and promptly brought to earth by rain or snow while still very radioactive. In 1987, however, most of the thousands of deployed Soviet ICBM warheads are 550 kilotons or smaller. See Jane's Weapon Systems, 1987 through 1988. The stabilized clouds of such explosions would be mostly in the troposphere, and some of even the tiniest particles, those small enough to be breathed into one's lungs, would be promptly scavenged and deposited in scattered hotspots. Fortunately, most of the very small and tiniest fallout particles would not be deposited for days to months, by which time radioactive decay would have made them much less dangerous. Breathing tiny radioactive particles into one's lungs would constitute a minor health hazard compared to other dangers that would afflict an unprepared people subjected to a large-scale nuclear attack. Here is figure 6.4. Stabilized radioactive fallout clouds shown a few minutes after the explosions, with distances that spherical fallout particles having diameters of 40, 50, and 100 microns fall in 8 hours. On this side of the table, it says height in miles. It goes from 1 to 22 miles up. And on this side is height in thousands of feet, from 0 to 120,000 feet. The first explosion is 20 megatons. The radius of stabilized cloud equals 20 miles. You can see that's the most damaging one. The next explosion is the 1 megaton. It has a radius equal to 5.1 miles. And then there's the smaller one next to it, which was the 200 kilotons, and it had a radius of 2.7 miles. It says the average height of bottom of the stratosphere and troposphere right here is going to be between, it's probably 7.5 miles in height. The 1 megaton reaches like 65,000 feet in the air. Meanwhile, the big dog 20 megaton reaches about 113,000 feet in the air. Scavenging of radioactive particles. Scavenging is most effective below about 30,000 feet. The maximum height of most rain and snow clouds, see figure 6.4, which we just looked at. Because the Soviets have deployed thousands of ICBMs with warheads of only 100 to 550 kilotons, Americans face increased dangers from very radioactive particles scavenged by rainouts or snowouts. the resultant hotspots of fallout heavy enough to kill unsheltered people in a few weeks could be scattered even hundreds of miles downwind from areas of multiple explosions, especially missile fields. Prudent Americans, even those living several hundred miles from important targets, whenever practical, should equip their shelters with adequate ventilating pumps and dust filters. This potential danger from extremely small fallout particles will be worsened if the United States deploys mobile ICBMs, such as Midgetmen, probably on large military reservations in the West. The Soviet Union already has mobile ICBMs in its nuclear forces. In the event of a Soviet attack, our hard-to-target mobile missiles probably would be subjected to a barrage of relatively small warheads, airbursted so as to blanket their deployment areas. The resultant large clouds of extremely small radioactive particles in the troposphere usually would be blown eastward, and resultant life-endangering hotspots from rainouts and/or snowouts could be scattered clear to the Atlantic coast. Fortunately, even in many expedient shelters completed in a few days, filtered air can be provided by using a homemade cap to pump air through furnace or air conditioner filters, as described in the last section of Appendix B. To learn how you can supply a shelter at low cost with air so well filtered that essentially all extremely small fallout particles and ineffective aerosols are removed, see Appendix E, how to make a homemade plywood double action piston pump and filter. Page 62. These worsening potential dangers from extremely small, hot fallout particles brought promptly to Earth by scavenging are not likely to endanger nearly as many Americans' lives as would 24-hour fallout of much larger particles from surface and near surface explosions. Providing enough outdoor air to shelters rather than filtered air will continue to deserve first priority. Stopping or restricting shelter ventilation. When instrument readings or observations show that heavy fallout has begun to be deposited, shelter occupants should decide whether to restrict or stop ventilation. If it is windy outside, even some sand-like fallout particles may be blown into a shelter with large ventilation openings. However, ventilation should not be restricted long enough to cause weaker occupants to be on the verge of collapse from overheating, or to result in headaches from exhaled carbon dioxide. If a house is burning dangerously close to a separate earth-covered shelter, closing the shelter's ventilation openings for an hour or two usually will prevent the entry of dangerous concentrations of carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, or smoke. Most houses will burn to the ground in less than 2 hours. When an attack is expected, a shelter occupied or soon to be occupied should be kept as cool as practical by pumping large volumes of outdoor air through it when the outdoor air is cooler than the shelter air. This also will assure that the air is fresh and low in exhaled carbon dioxide. Then, if a need arises to stop or restrict ventilation, the shelter can be closed for longer than could be done safely otherwise. Ventilation/cooling of permanent shelters. A permanent family fallout shelter built at moderate cost before a crisis should have a ventilation system that can supply adequate volumes of either filtered or unfiltered air, pumped in through an air intake pipe and out through an air exhaust pipe. Provision also should be made for the grim possibility that fallout could be so heavy that a shelter might have to be occupied for weeks or even part-time for months. A small or medium-sized permanent shelter should be designed so that the most of the time after an attack, it can have adequate natural ventilation through its entryway and emergency exit. During hot spells, forced ventilation through these same large air passageways should be provided by using a homemade cap. This manual air pump, described in Appendix B, can force large volumes of air through low resistance openings with minimum effort. Ways to ventilate and cool permanent shelters are described in Chapter 17, Permanent Family Fallout Shelters for Dual Use, and in Appendix E, How to Make and Use a Homemade Plywood Double Action Piston Pump and Air and Filter. Warning: many official instructions for building and ventilating shelters are life-endangering. The reader is advised not to read this section if pressed for time during a crisis, unless he is considering building an expedient or permanent shelter described in an official civil defense publication. Because of the worldwide extreme fear of radiation, civil defense specialists who prepare official self-help instructions for building shelters have made radiation protection their overriding objective. Apparently, the men in Moscow and Washington who decide what shelter building and shelter ventilating instructions their fellow citizens receive, especially instructions for building and improving expedient shelters, do not understand the ventilation requirements for maintaining endurable temperature/humidity conditions in crowded shelters. It must be remembered that shelters may have to be occupied continuously for days in warm or hot weather. Russian small expedient shelters are even more dangerously underventilated than are most of their American counterparts, and can serve to illustrate similar ventilation deficiencies of American shelters. Figure 6.5 is a Russian drawing with its caption translated of a wood earth shelter. In a Soviet self-help civil defense booklet, anti-radiation shelters in rural areas. This booklet, published in a 200,000 copy edition, includes illustrated instructions for building 20 different types of expedient shelters. All 20 of these shelters have dangerously inadequate natural ventilation, and none of them have air pumps. Note that this high protection factor covered trench shelter depends on air flowing down through its dust filter with straw packing hay and out through its small exhaust duct with damper. As part of Oak Ridge National Laboratory's participation in Defense Nuclear Agency's DISTRO 1978 blast test, I built 2 Russian pole-covered trench shelters. These were like the shelter shown in Figure 6.5, except that each lacked a trapdoor and filter. As anticipated, so little air flowed through these essentially dead-ended test shelters that temperatures soon became unbearable. Page 63. Figure 6.5. Figure 20. Wood earth shelter without lining of the walls for clay soils, 10 occupants, 1 trapdoor, 2 dust filter with straw packing hay, 3 earth covered 60 to 80 cm thick, 4 roofing made of poles, 5 exhaust duct with damper, 6 is the curtain made of tightly woven cloth. 7, removable container for wastes. 8, water collecting sump. Note, bill of materials is rough lumber, 2.7 cubic meters, nails, 0.12 kilogram, wire, 0.64 kilogram, work requirement, 90 to 110 man hours, shielding coefficient 250 to 300. This picture is actually coming in pretty clear. You can see the design. There's a dude sitting right here on like a board or something. There's his chick over there, you know, cooking the meal. You can see in this arrow the number 240, I'm assuming in width. Down here is 475 from this point to this point. Here's number 1, which was the trap door to get in. It's made of wood. Number 2 is the dust filter with a straw packing hay right there next to the trap door. Number 3 is the earth covered 60 to 80 cm thick. And it's pointing to this area, I'm assuming. Yeah. The soil layer. Number 4 is the roofing made of poles that are going across the top. So when you're building it, you're putting your poles on first for the roofing, right? Then you cover the poles with number 3, which was the earth cover 60 to 80 cm thick. Number 5 is the exhaust duct with damper. I'm thinking it's this, but you can't see it because that's the only one that's missing. So it has to be this end. The number 5, which is the design on the other end for the exhaust duct with damper. Number 6 is the curtain made of tightly woven cloth. Here you can see the number 6, and it's pointing to this little thing right there. That is the curtain made of tightly woven cloth. Number 7 is the removable container for wastes. Number 7. So you're putting it closer to the door area where you're going to take a shit. And lastly, number 8 is the water collecting sump. And it's pointing to this square thing right there, which is kind of weird. I don't know if it's coming from where the number 2 is, the dust filter with straw packing. So maybe it rains and it comes in and it goes through the straw and it lands in the number 8 water collecting sump. It's a pretty cool design, honestly. It's kind of tight in there, but it's enough to survive. The Russian earth-covered expedient fallout shelters are based on military dugouts designed for brief occupancy during a conventional attack. Subsequently, they were improved for fallout protection, but were made much less habitable for Soviet civil defense specialists. Apparently, these specialists were ignorant of ventilation requirements, and almost certainly they did not field test small expedient fallout shelters for habitability. Tens of millions of Russians have been taught to build such shelters. Once any bureaucracy issues dangerously faulty equipment or instructions, it rarely corrects them except under pressure. I have experienced this reluctance even during wartime. When trying to improve faulty combat equipment that was causing American soldiers to lose their lives. Continuing proofs of such bureaucratic reluctance to correct dangerous errors are hundreds of thousands of potentially life-endangering civil defense pamphlets and booklets, especially the several editions of In Time of Emergency, kept nationwide in hundreds of communities, primarily for crisis distribution. Some American official instructions for building expedient shelters have been slowly improved over the decades. The best are given in the June 1985 edition of Protection in the Nuclear Age. One of the Federal Emergency Management Agency's widely available free booklets. Yet, even in this improved edition, no mention is made of the crucial need for forced ventilation during warm weather, nor for expedient, simple means for providing pumped air. Also, in the June 1985 edition of Protection in the Nuclear Age, the second crawlway entry/exit of the above ground door covered shelter. See Appendix A, period 4, is replaced by a 4 through 6 DIA pipe for ventilation, I guess diameter, which makes this very small shelter essentially dead-ended and thereby eliminates adequate ventilation in warm weather. With only a 6-inch diameter air exhaust opening, not nearly enough air can flow naturally in warm weather through this crowded shelter's room. Only about 39 inches wide by 34 inches high, as provided by habitability tests in Florida and elsewhere. A cap or directional fan must be used, even with 2 crawlway entry/exits. Page 64. The essential second crawlway entry/exit of the above ground door covered shelter was eliminated as the result of a recommendation by a contractor for FEMA charged with field testing and evaluating expedient shelters and improving abbreviated shelter building instructions. No habitability tests were required. So the contractor concluded in his 1978 report to FEMA that the second entry / exit should be eliminated because the building of entries is time consuming, and with this small a shelter, a second entry is really not justified. In peacetime, bureaucracies of all nations tend to divide up responsibilities between specialists and to promote means by which non-prestigious wartime problems can apparently be solved with the least expense and work. Directional fanning to ventilate shelters. The directional fanning instructions on the following 2 pages may save more lives than any other instructions given in this book for a home makeable survival item. I regret that no one rediscovered this pre-mechanization simple yet effective way of manually pumping air until after the original Nuclear War Survival Skills was published. In 1980, Dr. William Olson, a NASA research engineer, long concerned with improving self-help civil defense, rediscovered one kind of directional fanning. Since then, with the assistance of able Americans and others, I have designed and tested several types of directional fans. I have field tested and repeatedly improved the instructions to enable average people to quickly learn how to make and use such fans effectively. The great advantage of directional fanning is that almost anyone who is given the field-tested instructions can quickly make and use one of these simple fans. Only very widely available materials are needed. The main disadvantage is that directional fanning is a more laborious way to ventilate a shelter than using caps, as described in detail in Appendix B. Americans are not likely to receive directional fanning instructions from the Federal Emergency Management Agency. FEMA's predecessors, the Office of Civil Defense and the Defense Civil Preparedness Agency, were unable to get the millions of dollars necessary to buy factory-made caps and other manual air pumps to ventilate officially designated fallout shelters. and FEMA has avoided shelter ventilating controversies. No widely available official American publication includes instructions for making and using any expedient air pumping device. Thanks to Congressman Ike Skeleton, Democrat of Missouri and strong civil defense advocate, in 1981, I was able to demonstrate directional fanning to Luis Giuffrida, at the time the director of FEMA. I gave directional fans to the FEMA specialists concerned with shelter ventilation, all of whom have since left FEMA. To date, although directional fanning instructions have been reproduced in 3 private civil defense publications and some 600 copies of a metric version of the instructions were distributed to British civil defense professionals at the 1984 Annual Study of Civil Defense and Emergency Planning Officers, FEMA has not even evaluated directional fanning. Wow. In contrast, in 1981, I gave copies of instructions for both caps and directional fans to Dr. Yin Zhishu, the director of the People's Republic of China's National Research and Design Institute of Civil Defense. And the next day, he started evaluating these simple devices, of course. At the time, I was traveling extensively in China as an official guest, exchanging civil defense information. Dr. Yin, who heads all Chinese civil defense research and development, went with his top ventilation and shelter design specialists to a furniture factory in Beijing. There, I watched workmen quickly build both a large and small cap, and also directional fans. Then Dr. Yin and his specialists began using their air velocity meters to measure the volumes of air that these simple devices could pump. On the following days, I participated in more ventilation tests using caps and directional fans in tunnel blast shelters in Beijing and in the port city of Dalian. While watching these top Chinese civil defense professionals make and test caps and directional fans, I kept thinking this is the way Thomas Edison and Henry Ford would have evaluated simple devices of possible great importance to millions. The reader is urged to keep the following 2 pages of directional fanning instructions ready for reproduction in a crisis. These sections on the small 2-handled directional fan and the large 1-man fan will be the most useful to unprepared people. Ventilation by pairs of men using bed sheet fans is an effective method for forcing very large volumes of outdoor air through tunnels, corridors, and mines with ceilings at least 9 feet high, provided they have 2 large openings. However, this method requires organization and discipline. I'm going to end it right there.